Welcome to a special series from the Decarbonisation Dialogue, as we join in celebrating Wales Climate Week. This week, we shine a spotlight on Wales with inspiring conversations featuring artist and maker Bronwen Gwillim, Research Associate Jack Price from the Wales Centre for Public Policy, and Sustainability Manager Teifion Maddocks from Swansea University. We've loved catching up with these remarkable voices to explore their work, their perspectives, and how each of us can play a role in celebrating positive change in the fight against climate change. Tune in to the Decarbonisation Dialogue and discover ideas, inspiration and actionable steps towards a more sustainable future. Croeso I gyfres arbennig gan y Dialog Datcarboneiddio. Rydyn ni fynd I dathlu wythnos Hinsawdd Cymru. Wythnos yma, fi fyddwn ni yn canolbwyntio ac yn dathlu ddatblygiadau Cymru, a sgyrsiau difyr yn cynnwys yr arlunydd Bronwen Gwillim, cydymwaith ymchwil Jack Price o Ganolfan Polisi Gyhoeddus Cymru, a rheolwr cynaliadwyedd Teifion Maddocks o Brifysgol Abertawe. Rydym wedi bod wrth ei bodd yn dal I fyny ar lleisiau anhygoel hyn I archwilio ei gwaith, ei safbwyntiau a sut y gall pob un ohonom chwarae ei rhan mewn creu newid cadarnhaol yn y frwydr yn erbyn newid yn yr hinsawdd. Gwrandewch ar y Dialog Datcarboneiddio a darganfyddwch syniadau, ysbrydolaeth a chamau gweithredu tuag at ddyfodol mwy cynaliadwy.
With me today, I have Jack Price, Dr. Jack Price, who is a Research Associate at the Wales Centre for Public Policy, having joined the team as a Research Officer in July 2019. Jack's work for the Centre has largely focused on the environment and net zero and tackling inequalities priority areas with a focus on decarbonisation, just transitions and education and skills. He is particularly interested in taking a longer-term view of policy change and understanding the second-order effects of policy decisions. Jack's other work for the Centre include projects on race equality, diversity, preventing youth homelessness and the impacts of Brexit on trade, among others. Projects he has worked on have provided supporting evidence for Welsh Government policy making, including understanding how the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act can be used to enable a just transition to net zero and reforming its approach to lifelong learning in the context of the Tertiary Education and Research Act. Jack has a PhD and an MA in Analytic and Modern European Philosophy. Welcome to Jack.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So, Jack, can you start by telling us a little bit about your career and your interest in policies that help shape our future? And I would also like to understand what is the Wales Centre for Public Policy. I know it's providing independent support to the Wales regarding net zero transition 2035, but I'd like to know a little bit about how you started and how your interest in policy developed. And then please, can you tell us a little bit about the Wales Centre for Public Policy?
Absolutely, yes. So as you've said, I'm a research associate currently at the Wales Centre for Public Policy. I suppose I entered the policy world off the back of my PhD research, which was very interested in social and political philosophy. And through that, I became interested in the practice of politics. So beyond the arguments and debates and things that play out in the media, actually how things happen on the ground and how change is made. I joined the Wales Centre for Public Policy after a short stint working for the Welsh Government in a delivery function and have more or less been there ever since. And to say a little bit about what the Wales Centre is and what we do, we are a research institute based at Cardiff University. We're funded by the Welsh Government, by the Economic and Social Research Council and by Cardiff University. And our remit is to help policymakers in Wales access, understand and use the best available evidence to support them in tackling the challenges that they face and in making the decisions that they have to make. How that works in practice is that we work quite closely with policymakers to understand the nature of the policy challenge that they're facing, to respond to that in a way that meets their needs, and to do so as part of the overall policymaking process. The technical term for what we do is knowledge brokering. That means that we don't necessarily produce our own research, primary research, or provide our own substantial original contributions, though we have done that in some cases. What we do is we translate work that experts in the field have done into forms that are useful for policymakers. That can be on anything that's devolved to Wales and some things that aren't. And over my time at the centre, I've worked across all of these issues, but with a focus, as you've said, on that environment and net zero theme.
So it's largely about getting those experts, getting that information, gathering that good evidence, as you say, from that data and those experts and from all of that research. Jack, how would you describe Wales's current progress towards achieving its net zero targets? I think the Welsh Government legally is committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And what do you think makes Wales's approach to decarbonisation unique compared to the rest of the UK or indeed to Europe?
So I think it's fair to say that the picture is mixed. When you look at past performance, emissions have reduced and Wales has hit its first carbon budget target compared to the baseline level. As with the rest of the UK, the difficulty is that the low-hanging fruit have now been picked, and meeting further emissions targets requires more ambitious action and more difficult policy interventions as well. So where we see Wales sitting is broadly in line with the rest of the UK on that measure. There are a number of unique factors about Wales that shape its emissions. One of these is that until very recently, heavy industry was very much still a part of the Welsh landscape. Emissions from the Port Talbot steelworks, for instance, are a proportionally large share of Wales's total emissions. That no longer is the case. But apart from that, there are other factors in Wales that differ from the rest of the UK. Agriculture as well is a proportionally larger emitter in Wales and a notoriously tricky sector to decarbonise. And transport emissions, although they are very important, aren't the primary emission source in Wales as they are now for the rest of the country. In terms of the approach that Wales has taken, there's a number of pieces of legislation and also policies that have been implemented around decarbonisation that give a bit of impetus to public authorities and to others to take the lead in decarbonising. The first is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. This act was passed in 2015 and, among other provisions, requires public bodies in Wales to take a long-term approach to tackling the social, economic, environmental challenges that they face. It also requires bodies to have in mind a series of wellbeing goals, including not just sort of climate change, but also adaptation, nature, generally holistic environmental factors. And this legislation means that public bodies in Wales are required to act in ways which sort of meet those objectives, work in the 5 ways of working set out in that law, and are measured on those metrics. Other pieces of legislation include the Environment Act in Wales, which is largely concerned with assessing the state of nature. And that places a series of requirements on public bodies, particularly Natural Resources Wales, to assess and understand the state of local ecosystems, which means that the sort of the base level of understanding should in theory be quite high. And in terms of the public sector, there is an ambition for public sector decarbonisation by 2030, which requires, again, public bodies in Wales to be net zero across scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by that date.
So indeed, the Welsh Government has that 2030 for the public sector. And that's a huge challenge, isn't it? Because you've talked, and I do want to talk about those unique and special issues regarding the farming community and obviously housing stock you've got to consider. But we'll go back to that ambition, that 2030 ambition, because there are huge budgetary pressures, aren't there, on that as well? I mean, that's an issue, always an issue, isn't it?
It certainly is. And speaking with people in local authorities in Wales, those budgetary pressures are a key factor in the feasibility of reaching that ambition. And I should say they're not the only factor. There's also issues around the emissions that are in scope by 2030. Mm-hmm. But when you're looking at sort of scope 1 emissions in particular, those which are directly related to local authority operations, the cost of implementing those measures is quite large. While local authorities are very committed to reaching those net zero targets that they have, and as a rule very concerned about ensuring that they are acting in a way which is in line with the needs of future generations and the wider societal net zero target, They're also very concerned with social care, with maintaining their estates in other ways, education, housing, homelessness, a number of other budgetary pressures, which mean that a proposal to, say, decarbonise your council office has to compete against all of these other pressures in your capital budget in order to be passed. And that is a challenge.
And how do you, we've got those financial pressures, we've got moving at pace, and you're probably going to say we need to move faster and large scale. But how do you think local authorities can better engage with communities to ensure that decarbonisation is fair and inclusive? And I really do want to talk about those very specific issues regarding the rural farming areas. And I know the Centre itself has warned that climate policies can accidentally worsen inequalities if they're not designed and implemented carefully. So we've got to really ensure the policies that are developed, and you are providing a lot of that evidence, are actually protecting those vulnerable groups, particularly in those rural areas and those on lower incomes. But how do you think, when there is so much else going on in terms of what is going on in our world, what is going on in our lives, whether it's cost of living, etc., how can local authorities better engage with communities to ensure that decarbonisation is fair and inclusive and people feel that they are included, it's something that they can get on board with?
I think this is a key consideration, isn't it? And for the reasons that you've said and more, nobody wants to be told that they need to do X, Y, or Z differently, and also it's going to cost you more to do that, and it's going to make your life less convenient. So the challenge is to try and find ways to decarbonise and to adapt as well to the effects of climate change in a way that tries to avoid those sorts of things. And really looking at where we are as a country, that is, again, a challenge. There are things that you can do to adapt to that and to respond to that. One thing that we are looking at in the centre at the moment is this idea of green growth, of using the net zero transition as a means of economic development, particularly in parts of Wales where there is a post-industrial legacy of less economic opportunity, of lower household wealth. But really across Wales, how can we harness this transition which is happening and will continue to happen to provide economic opportunity, to actually improve living standards of people in those local areas? And I think that's one part of the solution, is to try and harness these things in order to realise the benefits for local communities. Another thing you can do is to follow the lead of other cities and regions internationally. There's a really good example from the city of Kamloops, which is in British Columbia in Canada. What they did is they, first of all, prepared an inventory of the emissions that Kamloops as a city was producing, and a list of interventions which could be put in place to sort of mitigate those, but they scored those against a number of factors. So first is the degree of emissions reductions that sort of intervention would produce, but also looking at the feasibility of that. So is that something that Kamloops as a city could do? Can it do that easily? Is this still, technologically unproven, or is this something that's more or less ready to go? But then also the sort of costs and benefits, both to the city itself and to ordinary citizens. So on the one hand, you might have a proposal that is really good at reducing emissions, but is unproven, really expensive to the city, and also will be financially challenging for local residents. And you might have a proposal which is less effective in terms of emissions reduction, but is easily feasible, doesn't cost very much to implement, and might actually result in financial benefit to citizens. By looking across those four different categories, you can identify policies where there are quick wins, realisable benefits, things that can be put in place now and which might lead to greater emissions reductions in the long term, rather than trying to proceed with tricky policies with less definable benefit and perhaps more costly for local residents. So in that sense, that sort of prioritisation can help you find policies that are more likely to be supported by local communities. In terms of direct engagement, then, if you have a idea of what those policies are, then you can go out and and talk to people. And you do need to talk to people. There is a need to move fast, but you can't move fast by sort of imposing your will on areas, many of which have frankly had various people's wills imposed on them over the past 50, 60 years without being listened to. And that has to be a genuine listening exercise, whether that's energy infrastructure or anything else that you want to do. You have to understand what people's ideas are, what their views are on it, and then respond to those. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes there is a genuine need for infrastructure to be done in a certain way. And in that case, it's about trying to articulate the benefits of that, preferably by giving communities a direct stake in the sort of success of whatever that might be in terms of infrastructure. Sometimes there are things that can be changed, ways that interventions can be managed in a way that is genuinely successful for local communities. And there's examples of that across a range of topics and areas that you can look at, whether that's sort of traffic management, which can be a bit of a sort of flashpoint for people's views and feeling that they might not be being listened to. But actually, if you do that in a way which listens to people, which sort of responds to some of the things that they suggest to you, many of which will be reasonable concerns or genuine suggestions that can improve the delivery of a plan, then they often are more likely to support it and to get on board, and that will make a more successful sort of policy of intervention overall. So it does have to be a genuine discussion. There does have to be that element of give and take, but in such a way that you are articulating the benefits, but also the need for these changes.
Mm-hmm. So it is that, I like that kind of give and take. It's that two-way conversation and how you communicate and bringing people on board, but accepting that people perhaps don't want to be told. It's having the information for people to make up their own minds. Now, the built environment is obviously one of the hardest sectors to decarbonise, and just on a very practical, so we've got the communication, but housing stock, for example, we've got a lot of housing stock, just like everywhere else in the UK, but in Wales, there is housing stock that's perhaps built with quite traditional materials. The EPC rating is low, the energy performance rating is low, and obviously there is the issue of homes being off-grid as well, relying on oil and coal, biomass, etc. How do you think, and there's a big cost, isn't there? Retrofitting, there's a cost to that. And on top of that, I'm sorry to say, there is this perhaps shortage, I think, of qualified workers to actually do the work that we need to get done. How do you think that barrier, how do you think that barrier can be overcome? Obviously we understand the financial pressures, but there's a lot of other practical issues out there. It's all very well to tell people about be more energy efficient, improve the energy of your home, but for a lot of people, they're simply living in homes that are obviously not the most modern, energy efficient places, and it's quite difficult, isn't it, to transform those homes?
Absolutely. And sort of as you say, Wales has some of the oldest and some of the least energy efficient housing stock, not just in the UK, but actually in Europe. So there is a particular challenge there. Setting aside the cost issue for now, although that is a massive barrier, things which can be done to incentivize people to make these changes. So you mentioned off-grid homes, of which we do have a lot in Wales. We have a highly rural population compared to the rest of the UK. But actually, these homes are already homes where you would see a financial saving from moving to a decarbonised energy source. Off-grid oil, off-grid gas are both more expensive than you'd pay if you had a heat pump installed in those homes in the majority of cases. So for these homes, it's about articulating those benefits, making sure that is clearly understood. I think there's a lot of discussion about this going on at the moment. That needs to be clearly informed by understanding what the cost is, but also what the benefit is. And if you're spending less on fuel for your house, then that helps to mitigate against what might be a slightly higher upfront cost for a heat pump compared to your gas or oil storage. And for other types of housing stock, so for instance, your typical terraced house, perhaps Victorian terrace. There might be an element of that at play, but there's also planning legislation and restrictions that will need to be adapted. In England, for instance, they've recently committed to remove a rule around where a heat pump can be placed in relation to the boundary of the property. Now, in Wales, that rule is still in place, and it's actually, I think, 3 metres in Wales, as opposed to 1 metre in England. If that rule can be repealed, preferably, that would open up a lot of those houses to potentially adopt this sort of decarbonised heating system, which would be beneficial in terms of meeting decarbonisation targets. Now, the cost is always going to be a factor. We know that heat pumps in particular are more expensive sticker price compared to a gas boiler replacement. The UK government grant still has a year or two left to run on it, but after that, we're sort of not sure if that will be continued, and if it isn't, what sort of other measures will be put in place. Colleagues working in Nesta suggested quite a lot of things that could be done to sort of reduce that cost, even if that incentive around installation is removed. So looking at things like shifting where taxation on energy bills is placed from electricity, which it currently is, onto gas, or to another form of raising those sorts of levies. Also, a range of quite interesting interventions around how you interest people in this, and whether you can put certain types of intervention in place on a sort of district basis or on a street by street basis that would reduce the cost due to economies of scale, but also open up scope for things like district heat systems and other possibilities like that. The challenge that you mentioned around trained installers is a part of this puzzle. Again, there are things which can be done to sort of encourage people into this. It's sort of a chicken and egg situation at the moment. So one of the things that we hear when we talk to sort of education providers is that many installers don't necessarily see the point in retraining to be able to install sort of low and zero carbon heat solutions because there's not much demand for them. But one thing that is potentially suppressing demand is the fact that you can't find a good trained installer to carry out this work, even if you want to do it. That cycle can be broken. It might require a larger scale investment project to sort of stimulate the market. It might require making this installation process quicker and easier to retrain in. So I know, again, going back to colleagues at Nesta, I know that they're putting in place a scheme for heat engineers to install a heat pump at their own house free of charge as a way of sort of getting that experience. There are things like that are going on. And ultimately, it's about having a clear direction of travel being set by the government, both the Welsh government and the UK government, around what sort of technologies are going to be used in the future and by when. There is a deadline for the installation of new gas boilers, but there is not yet an entirely clear picture on what technology is going to be available to replace it. Is it going to be led entirely by heat pumps? Is there a role for hydrogen heating, as some people will attempt to persuade you? Are there other things that might be in place in the future? And I think until the government can make that decision and set a clear direction of travel, not just on phasing out gas boilers, but on what's going to replace them, then those incentives aren't going to be there for engineers in the same way that they could be.
So it's obviously having that vision and that clear vision and communication, but obviously that cooperation between all of the sectors, the government, the private sector, local government and the communities is all very important. And then obviously throwing in innovation into that as well and looking for the innovation, the clean energy innovation, but also the training to support that. So let's just go back to the idea of this just transition. Can you explain in a kind of really simple terms what a just transition means in terms of the Welsh context? Because, and obviously allude to the affordability and obviously the fuel poverty considerations too. What does a just transition look like?
We would understand a just transition as being a transition to net zero, which does not increase inequality within the system and potentially also improves existing inequalities where this can be done. What this means in practice, I think, differs across different parts of the economy and different activities. But for instance, it could include making sure that workers who are affected by industry closure or change, such as those that we see in Port Talbot with Tata Steel, are given the opportunity to retrain, reskill, and have the ability to return to employment in jobs which are ideally as skilled and as well paid as the ones they've had to leave, in areas that are accessible for them. Looking at fuel, as you say, it means ensuring that decarbonisation of home heating doesn't worsen fuel poverty by making heating more expensive, ideally reduces the overall cost of energy to households. Also one that can be used to develop opportunity across Wales. So a lot of Wales is profoundly affected by the legacy of previous transitions, the transition away from coal over the late 20th century being the prime example, but there are others. And actually using the opportunity that is afforded by the transition to net zero to try and redress some of those past wrongs and to revitalise those local economies which have been, as I say, sort of struggling since this industry closure.
Jack, how has your own thinking evolved through your research regarding climate action?
The main thing that has changed for me is an appreciation of how vast and complex the challenge is, actually, both in terms of the actors involved, the coordination involved, and the degree to which these decisions can be affected by path dependencies set in place, perhaps without even understanding what they are. That sounds quite depressing, but a more positive way to look at it, I think, is that it's a complicated challenge that is nonetheless well understood. We know more or less what we need to do. We more or less know, thanks to the work of the Climate Change Committee and others, what that's going to look like. The challenge is just putting it in place. That is not a unreasonable position to be in. When you look at some of the challenges that we've faced as a nation and as a society over the course of our history, there have been many times when we've had to face challenges where we've understood very little about any of this. We've faced pandemics and plagues when we had no idea what was causing them. We've had horribly destructive wars where we've had to mobilise the entirety of society to face up to potentially fatal threats. In this case, we've got a pretty good picture of what's going on. We know what the problem is. The challenge is mobilising in a way that brings everyone with us and in enough time.
And that's key, isn't it? Mobilising people and all of those organisations and people, as we've said, within the time that we have and knowing what we're facing. My final question is, what advice would you give a professional, a young person today who wants to work in this area of climate action?
My advice would be, firstly, to get involved. I think it is a challenging time in a lot of respects for climate action, but because it's a challenge, there is a urgent need for passionate, committed, clever people to be involved, not just in designing and developing solutions, but also in that role of understanding, persuading, and convincing people to come along. And I think that is the key challenge. And at a time where, as we've said earlier, people are stretched, people are struggling, if there are people who can support and passionately convince people about the benefits of this transition, not just from an environmental perspective, but also actually the benefits that they can feel for how we all live and work together, that is something which can sort of overcome some of those initial concerns or initial resistance and ensure that we can keep going and keep the momentum up that we will need if we want to hit net zero.
Super, thank you. And that's a really positive message. Be involved and be part of that conversation. And then as well, let's get on with mobilising other stakeholders to make this happen. Thank you to Dr. Jack Price from the Wales Centre for Public Policy for joining me today. There can be no doubt that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. Today, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Today, we must act for tomorrow, adjusting our lifestyles to current and future impacts of climate change. Today, we must use our collective wisdom to deliver on our climate commitments. Today, we work for tomorrow's world. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels, and please do let us know what you think at podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. Thank you very much to Jack. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our special edition of the Decarbonisation Dialogue, celebrating Wales Climate Week. Diolch o galon am wrando i ein gyfres arbennig o'r Deialog Datgarboneiddio yn dathlu wythnos Hinsawdd Cymru.
For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.